when we look at history through the lives of people whose views haven't readily been studied and haven't readily been written about, it really gives us a different perspective on these big moments in history. We're talking about the moon landing and we're talking about these classic Disney films, and it's just a different way of seeing that part of history. It really does give you a different perspective on things.
That was Nathalia Holt, author of The Queens of Animation, and you're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Thanks so much for joining me here on episode 94 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. I am your host, Dan Heaton. I read a lot of books about Disney, the parks, history, animation, Walt. So much information is in this brain. However, there are still a lot of topics that I don't know that much about. And even in some cases where I think I know the main story, that's often not the case. I realized this quickly as I was reading Nathalia Holt's book, The Queens of Animation, the untold story of the women who transformed the world of Disney and made cinematic history. Right away, from the very first story in the book, I realized there are a lot of women that worked at Disney in the 1930s, 40s, and beyond. I don't know anything about their stories. Even Mary Blair, who I felt like I knew her story through It's a Small World and some of her other work, there was a whole nother side to Mary's background and her contributions to Disney that I didn't know much about. And when you go beyond that to Retta Scott and Sylvia Holland and so many others that have worked at Disney in the story department as animators, their histories have largely been forgotten or just never told. And that's why I think it's so important to spotlight this book, because it's a rarity. It's an important history book of Disney animation that hasn't really been told in this way. And that's why I was super excited to talk to Nat, who is my guest today on the podcast. I wanted to learn more about her. She has a really interesting background. She has a PhD in microbiology. She's written several other books, starting with Cured, The People Who Defeated HIV, and another book that I really enjoyed, Rise of the Rocket Girls, which is about women who worked at JPL and helped the space program. That was a fascinating book, so I'm glad we got to talk a bit about that too. There's just a lot there to cover, especially with the women at animation from Disney history. And Nat has some great stories about the people she covers in her book. And it was a lot of fun to learn more about her process putting together the book and then also about the stories within the book. So let's get to it. Here is Nathalia Holt.
Well, as you know, I am not a Disney historian. I don't have a lifelong passion for Disney. So I came to the story really by accident. And it started while I was researching my last book, which is about a group of women who worked at NASA starting in the 1940s and had really long careers as part of aviation and spaceflight. And one of the women I was speaking to, before she came to work at NASA, she worked at Disney. And she had all of these crazy stories about what life at Disney was like in the 40s and 50s. And I really enjoyed talking with her. And I think what most surprised me in that interview was that there were so many women in her stories. And I realized that besides the women of ink and paint, I really didn't know much about female artists at Disney or female animators. And so I really wanted to learn more about them. And so I turned to a few biographies of Walt Disney. And of course, there are many out there. And what I found was that all of these women, all of these names I had just learned, were basically absent from the book. And this was really disappointing. And so I decided that I really wanted to try to learn as much as I could about this group of women and their contributions. And I was fortunate enough to be able to find their families and gain access to some wonderful documents. And it's really opened my eyes. It's really made me view Disney and view these movies so differently now.
Yeah, it surprised me because I knew about, a few of the names like Mary Blair, of course, and others. And I've read probably a lot of information about Disney history. And I like you said, a lot of the names I didn't know, and especially a lot of the contributions like to some really classic films just have not been brought out like this. And so as you were digging in and doing more and more research, like what were you surprised to learn the most kind of as you were going along?
There were a lot of surprises, definitely. I think for me, the thing that I found the most strange was that the Nutcracker and our cultural obsession with that ballet actually started at Disney. It actually started because of Fantasia. And there is a woman named Bianca Majoli who was the first woman hired in the story department at the studio. She was hired directly by Walt, and she's actually the one that picked out the Nutcracker Suite. And that music at the time, this is the late 1930s, was not popular at all in the United States. No version of the Nutcracker Ballet had ever even been performed in this country. And it was really not even easy for her to find a full-length recording of the ballet. And so she plucked out this music really from obscurity, brought it to the studio. Walt falls in love with it. And then you have a number of really talented female artists that end up working on this, as well as, of course, some very talented male artists. And the Nutcracker ends up becoming this phenomenon that, of course, today you can't even imagine a December without the Nutcracker. But it really did start because of Disney.
Yeah, that's really surprised me. That was one story that I read it, and it's one of those things where you read it and you're like, wait, what? What is this? I didn't know this at all. And I thought all this stuff about Fantasia and how that was put together was so interesting because even that had such an impact. But then you had the male animators who were unable and also very uncomfortable trying to animate fairies. So could you talk a bit about just how that ended up working with Fantasia and the situation there?
What's interesting about Fantasia is you have Sylvia Holland, who is Disney's first female story director. And this, of course, is taking place in the late 1930s, early 1940s. And she is in charge of a fairly large group of people. So she's working on the Nutcracker suite of Fantasia. And so she's doing this along with Bianca Majoli and many other women who are part of their group. And some of the men in their group decide that because they are drawing fairies, they don't want to be involved. And so for a while there on this section of Fantasia, it is an all-female group. And this was very surprising to me, although perhaps it shouldn't have been. Some men do, of course, end up joining their group, and the feelings about fairies change pretty quickly. And what we see is that over the years, of course, men end up drawing many fairies at Disney. And so I talk about kind of that transition from Pinocchio and the Blue Fairy up through Peter Pan and, of course, Mark Davis's work on Tinkerbell. But it was interesting to look at that evolution of fairies at the studio and how that happened and how the women were involved. And I was definitely struck by that detail because it just seemed so laughable, didn't it, that a studio that's so known for their depiction of fairies would originally have these artists not willing to draw them.
Yeah, because like you mentioned Tinkerbell and certain other, other examples where, yeah, it's a big part of what makes, well, I mean, you think of Tinkerbell, being almost like a symbol of the company in a certain way with the wonderful world of Disney and everything. And you mentioned Bianca Majoli, and you start the book with an interesting moment where she's trying to present her sketches in a story meeting to Walt Disney and other men. And what's really like an evocative moment where right off the bat, it's kind of like, it shows some of the challenges that she had. And I'd love to hear you talk a bit about that and kind of that moment.
So, this is a really powerful moment, I think, in the book because it shows how difficult life can be for the first female to enter in an all male field. And that's what Banco Majoli is. When she joins the story department in 1935, she is the first woman in their ranks. And it is a big deal. And we know that in many industries, to be the first woman is difficult. And certainly that was true for Bianca. And so during this one story meeting, what happens is that the storyboards she is presenting are just ripped apart, not only by words, but even by actions. And of course, story meetings could always be a very difficult place. They still are today. It's still a very intense world to be presenting your ideas in front of the group. And at this time, Walt hates her ideas so much that he literally rips her drawings off the storyboard where they were put in with push pins and just tears them apart onto the floor. Bianca is very upset. She starts crying. She runs down the hall to where she has her office, and a number of men end up following her, and they actually end up breaking down her office while she is just sitting crying in the corner. And as difficult as it is to read the scene, it is really, in a way, even more moving when you read Bianca's letters about this incident, because this was very distressing for her. And so when you read about how difficult this moment was for her, it really solidifies how hard life must have been in these very early days at the studio. And I guess I should mention here, of course, that this is the 1930s. So it's not particularly surprising that there were these difficult moments at Disney during this time, as there were in workplaces all over the world and certainly all over the United States during this time. But what's good is that things get better. Bianca is the first, but eventually more women are hired, and life does get a little easier for them, definitely. And it's an interesting transition for me to look at how Walt's opinion on his female employees change over time, because we see that he has this moment with Bianca in the beginning where he is very critical of her and he's very uncertain whether women can do well in this environment. He says this very directly to the women that he's hiring, that you can't be soft, you have to be able to take practical jokes. And then what we see is that just 10 years later, he is making a speech to his employees in 1941 where he says, "The girl artists have the right to expect the same chances for advancement as men, and I honestly believe that they may contribute something to this business that men never would or could." And I just find this quote so remarkable that in this period of time, he went from really not being sure that women could be part of the business to feeling that women have to be part of the business and that they're really going to make a difference. And I think that is very much to the credit of these early female artists.
I really appreciated seeing kind of a well-rounded look at Walt Disney, because you can easily look at it and you could take this story and, yeah, like you mentioned, he's, it's the 1930s and he's still, it's a male dominated studio. But then also, like you mentioned with that speech, and even with how you bring out comparisons to other studios and kind of how things work there, where he was in a way promoting female animators and in the story department at a level slightly different than some of the other studios, but then also still had challenges. So I really appreciated that. Just like you see him, and again, he's a real person who had a lot of different sides to him, even given how Bianca joined the studio, where, she had written letters and everything, and that connected with him in that way, which again kind of is interesting given her career and what happened there.
Yes, that's true, because she knew him from high school only briefly. They really didn't know each other very well. They were just casual acquaintances. But she did have that connection to him, which is how she was able to get an interview and really how she was able to get her foot in the door at Disney. But she ends up being fired really without ceremony. What happens is she just comes back from vacation and finds that her desk is cleared out and it belongs to someone else. And this, of course, is a devastating thing to have happen, but particularly because of how much she contributed to the studio and how many of her ideas, although they weren't all realized while she was working there, end up coming into play later. And so we see that with Peter Pan, with Cinderella, that many of these things that she was working on very early on come back. And so it is heartbreaking to see that. Branca probably had the most difficult experience of any other woman in the studio, although of course they all have different struggles. But it's certainly worth mentioning that it is Walt's relationship with her and then with these other women that really change how he sees the studio and how he decides to pursue different projects. And I do think it's remarkable that he hired so many women. It really was not done at the time. It was very different than other Hollywood studios. And he really took these chances on these women who end up being very important to the future of his studio.
Totally, yeah. I mean, because you go through almost each of their early and then future releases, but a great example being Mary Blair with Cinderella, where that movie being so important to the future of the studio, like you explain in the book, essentially after the war and package films and the studio, now we look at Disney and we say, oh, it's incredible. But Cinderella was a huge part of making that happen. Can you talk about Mary's contribution just to that film and how that kind of set up Disney?
Oh, absolutely. So, in 1948, you have the studio is millions of dollars in debt. And Walt actually says to his employees, this is it. If this film doesn't make money, the studio is going to go kaput. And this film that they're working on is, of course, Cinderella. And Mary Blair is probably the best known of all of the artists that I write about. But I do think that even she hasn't been given enough credit for Cinderella, because it's really this movie that makes such a difference to the studio. They're in debt, they need to make money, and yet the way that they make their films is just incredibly expensive. And that's, because it takes 20 to 30 drawings for every second of film. And so every one of those little details that's in all of their drawings ends up costing them so much money. And so Mary Blair, working as art director on the film, ends up making a decision that to save money, they are going to use this very bold color and this very bold styling that by using this color, it really conveys emotions. And so you have these dark blues, and it just pulls you into this very lush environment. And in addition, after that, you have Cinderella, who is being chased by these horsemen, and then that's in this really bold red and black. And in each of these scenes, you have color then substituting for the lines, which then really gives the film that luscious Disney look, but saves on cost. And so then in 1950, when Cinderella is released, the film, of course, is an incredible success. And the studio is essentially rescued by this princess.
I mean, I know that Cinderella is one of the more popular movies even from Disney history, but to hear that story and just her involvement, it cements the idea of just how important it was. And interesting too, because I knew Mary mostly through what we know about It's a Small World and about even things she's done for the parks, but getting the chance to have examples like that. But on the flip side, one thing that came out in your book that I found sad, but also very, very interesting, is her personal story, which I thought, with her husband's abuse and with everything that it's not something, at least to my knowledge, that is very commonly known. That's something where, due to the time, she just didn't have a lot of options, and it really impacted her. So I would love to hear you talk about kind of uncovering that, because I don't think it's something that was really that well known.
It really isn't. It's something that, of course, the family is very delicate about talking. And it's something that other historians, while they have some inkling of what her life was like, really haven't delved into. And one example is John Canemaker. He's written a few really lovely books about Disney artists. I mean, many books, of course, but a few just about Mary. And these books, of course, are mostly art books. There aren't that many personal details about their lives in the books themselves. But there are a few lines about Mary in there. And in one of his books, he says that the scope of Mary's life should be saved for another work. And when I read that in his book, I just was like, well, wait, but where's that other book? I want to read that book about Mary's life. And so I was really fortunate because I contacted John Canemaker, and he was able to give me access to a number of interviews that he had done with Mary's sons and with other people in Mary's life that were very sensitive. These were the issues of abuse and the difficulties she dealt with in her marriage and with her family that had previously never been published. He had taken these interviews, he'd set them aside, and he was really waiting to release them to the right person. And I was very fortunate to have access to those. And that's really thanks to Mary Blair's nieces, who were very supportive of the project and really desired to have the life of Mary Blair written about in a way that explained her experiences, but didn't sensationalize them. And so that's really what I tried to do here, was put into context what her life was like and the difficulties she dealt with. And I think it's particularly poignant when you look at the It's a Small World ride, because she's creating these just beautiful scenes and these happy children. And what she's dealing with at home is really quite ugly.
I mean, it's one of those things where when you hear the story, I almost appreciate more even what she accomplished given just the challenges in her life and some of the beautiful things, like you mentioned, It's a Small World, and so much more that she created. And it's really stunning to read. And I, like you said, I don't feel like it was sensationalized at all. It's just fascinating info to hear. So I appreciate that we know more because, like you said, it gives us a fuller example of her life and what she kind of was dealing with at the time. And one thing I wanted to mention on a related note that I appreciated about the book is just you're putting everything in the context of the history of the company. So like having read the official autobiography and then other books, the history books about Walt, and getting the chance to kind of learn more about each area, like the strike, for example, because I feel like I've read a lot about the strike, but to learn about it from the individuals, especially the women that work there and kind of their challenges, I found that interesting because, you know, for them, it was very different even than a lot of the other animators. So I'd love to hear you talk a bit about that.
Yes, it was interesting writing about the strike because, of course, you're right. It's been written about so many times, but to see it through their eyes is really different, especially because for some of these women, they were not married. Some of them were divorced, such as Ethel Kusar, and some of them were widowed, such as Sylvia Holland, and some were not married at all, such as Retta Scott. And these were women that really depended on that income. And in addition to that, they also really loved Walt. You know, here was a man that had taken a chance on them and given them this great job, and they loved their work, and they were very loyal to the company. And so it was interesting to see the strike through their eyes, you know, through the eyes of women who really had a lot of people, in some cases, such as Sylvia Holland, had a lot of people depending on them. She had a family who really had been through a lot and who she was trying to bring back together and get to be with her children again. And it really was a struggle for her during this period, because we see, of course, that everyone is suffering during this time. No matter what side of the strike you fall down on, it was just a monumental time in Disney history. And I really enjoyed telling some of the personal stories about it, you know, about how on either side of the strike were. It really struck me with Retta Scott, of course, because she had such a connection with Walt. She really cared for him. He was a father figure, essentially, to her. And so, of course, she was not part of the strike. She stayed with the studio. And during that time, she did an enormous amount of work as an animator because they needed her. They had not enough hands. So she was desperately needed on a number of different projects. And as she's driving into the studio one morning, these protesters or strikers, sorry, end up pounding on her car and saying, "What are you doing? You shouldn't even be here anyway." Really, really making her feel bad for being a woman who's entering the studio. And it was sad for me to tell that part of Retta's story because it was such a struggle for her during that time. And then, of course, like all other Disney employees, she does end up eventually getting laid off as the studio shuts down. And then even though she had, devoted so much of herself, when she's rehired, she's not one of the first to be rehired. And when she is, she's not brought back in again at that same place as animator. And of course, this is a complex issue because there were so many different negotiations that had to be made in terms of salary and hiring both strikers and non-strikers. But it's just, I can't even imagine what that must have been like for her to have sacrificed so much during that time. And then to have lost that really critical position, which for her, of course, is important. But really for all of us, it's a big deal because here she is, the first credited female animator at Disney for her work on Bambi. And then that's all just taken away so quickly.
Yeah, because you have even the picture on the front of your book, which I think is a great picture of her sketching for Bambi and just reading about her role on that film. I mean, that she was so talented and did so much to make that what was really a tricky film to work, which, and there were so many animators on that, but her role was very important. And then that's what connected with me, like you mentioned about the strike too. I've read it so many times from Walt's perspective, which is also sad, but to see it again, because like you said, things were never the same there, but already with the women there being so few, the odds when it came back, it was going to be a real challenge. So I think that story really connected with me. And you mentioned two credits, which I think is important to bring up because you talk a lot about the contributions of the women in the story department and animators. Rarely are they ever credited. And I know it's very different today, but can you talk a bit about why was that the case and like how difficult it was for them to receive credit?
So credits were a very contentious issue at Disney. It wasn't just women, of course. There were many men whose work wasn't credited either. Credits were so much shorter then. Yeah. It wasn't like today where, everyone gets their due. And so you can imagine what the environment for that was like. You really had to be able to put yourself forward in order to get those credits. And so I tell a great story in the book about Sylvia Holland and about how she, as this story director, the first female story director for Fantasia, finds out that she is not going to be credited on that film. And credits for Fantasia were handled very differently than the others. They were actually just printed in a booklet. So it wasn't even as official as having your name on the screen. But still, Sylvia is just livid by this. She cannot believe that she is not getting credited when she is such an essential part of this film. And so she storms over to Walt and yells at him about this. And this is not her personality at all. She is not the kind of person to yell at Walt Disney. But she feels so passionately about this. And so she's able to get credit for that film. And in addition, she insists that all the other women who's working with her also get credit. And so that's a very big moment. But we see that for the most part, they don't get much credit for their work. And it's really only Mary Blair who ends up getting mostly credited for the work she does. And I think a lot of that has to do, of course, with how much she did in these films, because a lot of her early work was not credited. But I think it also has to do with how much Walt Disney valued her as an artist. He really, really believed that she was an extremely talented artist, and she really was one of his favorites. So I think that has a big part to do with it as well.
That gets me to when Walt Disney passed in 1966, where Mary, who had played such a big role even in It's a Small World several years earlier, then has a very different place at Disney. And even just the way the studio went after he died, like what changed there for her? And then just in general, kind of in that period in the 60s and 70s after he was gone.
It's a sad part of the book, isn't it? Because here she's contributed so much. And in these last years with Walt, he had given her these really exciting projects at Disneyland and at Walt Disney World where, She's working on these rides and on murals and doing all of this great work. And so it's sad to see that there was so much jealousy because of her. And I think a lot of this does come back to the fact that Walt really did favor her. He really loved her as an artist. He gave her a lot of advantages that he didn't give other artists, and it really speaks to how talented she was. She was able to work remotely from New York and to travel back to LA, which is something that no other artist had the opportunity to do at Disney. And so because I think of all of these advantages, there was so much envy. And after Walt dies, she is not able to get another job at Disney. And she tries very hard to get a job at many different places, but she finds it almost impossible to get work at that time. And it really leads to a sad decline in those years where she's dealing with some very big issues in her marriage and with her children. And it's a really a low point in her life.
Yeah, and I feel like I don't want to focus. There's a lot of positive things in the book too, but I feel like that story. I feel like I'm focusing on all on more of the challenges.
Too, yeah.
But we'll finish strong here. But I wanted to mention this because I feel like with Mary, like we've talked about her role in Cinderella and It's a Small World, and it was so sad to me to kind of find out about, not only losing Walt, which was very sad for the studio, but its impact on her. And I know that, in general, at least it took a little while before the studio, one, kind of recovered, but also just really started hiring a lot more women and just a diverse group of animators, which at least, from reading your book, played a big role in the Disney Renaissance under Michael Eisner and others, and how that kind of pushed forward. So can you talk a bit about that time period and how things sort of changed for the better in a lot of ways?
Yes, so it's interesting to look at the period after Walt's death, because the number of films that came out during that time are really, for most critics that look at that period, they are not the same quality as the films that came out before or those of the Disney Renaissance after. And certainly if we look at the number of female employees at the studio, it goes way down during that period. And I think that really speaks to how much Walt valued female artists. He hired many of these women. He brought them in. He mentored them. He really promoted them within the studio. And so I'm able to, in the book, talk about the few women, of course, that are important during that period of time and share some of their stories. But it's interesting to see then, what happens when the studio starts changing and during the Renaissance. And I really enjoyed writing about Brenda Chapman and her role at the studio. It was really interesting to learn about how she came into the studio and was told that, oh, it's okay if you don't work out because we'll just hire someone else. So there certainly wasn't a lot of confidence when they first brought her into the story department. And she ends up doing incredibly well and becoming, of course, head of the story department for a time. And she doesn't even realize how many women had worked there before. She really believes that she is the only woman in Walt's story department because of how the time has passed and so many of these women had been forgotten. And so I really enjoyed, getting to talk to her, but then also to many of the people who are working there today and are really trying to bring back the memories of these women.
Yeah, it's great to hear more of the recent stories. I love the story. Well, love might be a strong word, but the story about Belle and with Linda Wolverton about how they wanted to have her baking a cake. And I'm trying to envision kind of the alternate reality where that's in Beauty and the Beast. And I have a feeling it might not have done as well. So that's really surprising to me.
Yes, that's such a great story, isn't it? That here she is and they're having Belle decorate a cake and she's just, no, I will not have Belle doing that. And she is so strong-minded about it and she really pulls it off. She really brings reading, of course, to Belle's character. And it's all of these story parts that these women did. I mean, of course, it's a strong team of writers and they work very in depth. But I think that, we can see that the more diversity you have in the story department in general is a good thing. It's good to have different voices and different perspectives. And it strengthens all of these stories when you have that. So it was really fun to look at the contributions of these different artists and how they shaped the films.
Yeah, I mean, even now with Jennifer Lee, who's now co-leading Disney Animation with Pete Docter, with John Lasseter leaving, the story about Frozen and just, I have two daughters, and that movie is very focused on sisters and kind of how that came together. It's interesting to me to read just, where that story was before they switched that part of the story, which ultimately I think played a big part in making the movie so good.
I agree. And, it's also interesting to see that Frozen didn't just start in our modern era. It really has this long history at the studio where it was originally envisioned in the 1940s, of all things. I mean, how funny is that they were working on it back then? And then, of course, dropped and brought back around. Mark Davis brought it up and was interested in making it a ride in the parks. And then, of course, we see it go through all these iterations and go from Elsa being this horrible Cruella de Vil character who freezes the heart of Anna to then this lovely sister summit. And this is such a magical moment in the book, I think, where you have all of these women from over the studio who are coming together and sharing their stories. And it's something that really these early pioneers could only have dreamed of, to, have had that ability to really gather together and bring their ideas to screen. And so it was wonderful to be able to interview some of these modern artists at Disney today. I also really enjoyed speaking with Michael Giammo, who's art director on Frozen and Frozen 2. And he is just obsessed with Mary Blair. He is so funny. He says, I always carry her in my heart, even though I've never met her. And that's really, it speaks to the passion he has for her art. And he really wants to be bringing her sense of style back into films today. And I think he's done just such a lovely job in those films.
Yeah, one thing that really comes out to me kind of by the end of the story, and we've read about the ups and downs of a lot of really talented individuals that were animators and such from the entire history of Disney, but especially now kind of feeling more positive in general about where the studio's going, and just a lot of the things you just mentioned recently, where there's a lot of good things that hopefully are coming based on where the studio is now.
Yes. I didn't talk much in the book about John Lasseter or those kind of issues because I really wanted this book to be about these female pioneers at Disney. But I have to say, I think Jennifer Lee and Pete Docter are such wonderful choices to be leading the charge there. They're both just so extremely talented, and they have a real sense of history, especially Pete Docter. He has a real feeling about some of these female pioneers and about how to honor them in films. It's something that he's done repeatedly in a very quiet way. He's brought the Mary Blair character into Up in the form of Ellie, where he's shown these Mary Blair paintings on the walls of their house. And he really has a sense of, I think, how to honor the contributions of them.
Oh, I totally agree. And I think that I really enjoyed the book. And before we finish though, I did want to learn a little bit more about you and your background and how you even got into writing these books that you are, because I know that you started out as a microbiologist, which in a very different field, and then went into writing and ultimately have written several just great books. So I'm curious for you, how did that transition happen? And is this something you always wanted to do?
Well, it's definitely something I've always wanted to do, and I feel so fortunate to be able to write these books. It's not something I ever really expected, though. I have a PhD in microbiology, and I worked in HIV research for a decade. And my first book is based on my research in HIV, and it's a lot of history, as well as looking at kind of modern technologies, looking at gene therapy and some of the work being done today. And so while I was writing that book and in the lab, I really wanted to tell the story of the Rocket Girls, these early women at NASA. And it had been something that I had been dreaming of for a long time since my daughter was born in 2010, and she's 9 now. And so I had really had this connection with these early women. These are women that it took me a lot of time to find and to interview. And so I ended up being able to write this book about them. And it just opened up a lot of opportunity for me. It really let me be able to focus on writing and be able to really be able to, go into the deep dives for these books that are kind of required in order to be able to do the interviews and the research. And I feel so lucky to be able to do it now.
Yeah, and I also read Rise of the Rocket Girls recently. And again, I mentioned, I'm also an Apollo junkie and someone who's read a lot of books about the space program. And again, I'm familiar with the stories recently with Hidden Figures and a lot of that. But this still, a lot of the stories from JPL and the rockets and even the probes that were being sent to view Mars and the moon so early on that somehow mostly completely escaped my attention. So I really appreciated getting to know those stories in a similar way to even what you did with the Queens of Animation in an area that I thought I knew and only sort of knew.
Yeah, I really enjoyed being able to talk about the Jet Propulsion Lab because it is one of these parts of NASA that many people aren't familiar with the missions coming from this part of Southern California. And so it was really fun to be able to talk about all the work that's happened there. And it's still happening today, of course.
It's great because, and in a sense too, because, there was work on the space program, but also at the same time, they're working on missiles, and there's that kind of weird dichotomy there where it's about exploration, but then there's the other elements to it at the same time, especially in the 50s and such. So I found all that interesting because they're doing these great advances, and then the rockets keep blowing up, and there's a lot of challenges, which, our rockets always blow up is how it was for a while. But then ultimately helping to lead to the moon and beyond, well beyond. It's great to kind of go through that up and down ride as you go through the book.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it was fun to write about. I think I most enjoyed writing about the Voyagers, though, which of course are far after the moon. It's all the way into the 1970s. The first one was launched in 1977, and it was so much fun to speak with the women about that mission because, for most of them at that point, they had worked at the lab for 30 years. And so now here they are getting to send the first spacecraft. They're going all the way out to Jupiter and Saturn and Neptune and sending back all of these beautiful images of our solar system. It was so exciting to hear about what that time was like and what it took to do that mission. It was very different than I expected. It was not an easy mission to get approval from, especially given all of the budget cuts at NASA. So it was really exciting. And also because the women themselves have such a deep friendship with one another that it was fun to be able to tell those stories as well.
Yeah, it's great. Just like you mentioned, the challenges, especially given with Vietnam and everything in the 70s, that what they accomplished is incredible. And the friendship, which I think is important to note, because I think you do a good job in the book of really talking about how they connected with each other and that, became back even, in the early days of computers, which is, of course, what a lot of the women were called before the IBMs came in, but then well into the future at the time. So it's a great story, and I'm glad I got to read it.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. I think when we look at history through the lives of people whose views haven't readily been studied and haven't readily been written about, it really gives us a different perspective on these big moments in history. We're talking about the moon landing and we're talking about these classic Disney films. And it's just a different way of seeing that part of history. It really does give you a different perspective on things.
Oh, totally. I mean, I appreciate it more after reading the book. There's a lot of, we have a ton of Blu-rays and DVDs on our shelves that I have not picked up and watched in a while. That now I'm kind of like, I want to go back and watch Pinocchio again or Bambi or ones that, aren't always the first choice. So, which is fun to get to kind of look at them from a different lens. So on a related note, though, do you have any projects that you are currently working on or you'd like to do that you could talk about right now, or are they still kind of early in the works?
It's still a little early. I am working on something, but it's still a bit early. But I'll let you know as soon as it's better formed and better able to be viewed by others.
No, I understand. I definitely don't want to spoil an early project when you're still figuring out exactly what it is. But I'm excited to hear about it. So in general, like if listeners want to learn more about what you're doing or your books, like where's a good place do you think they should go?
Well, I'm on Instagram and on Twitter sometimes, and there's my website, nathaliaholt.com. So those are all great places to find me.
Well, great. Well, this has been a lot of fun. I really enjoyed the books and had a lot of fun getting to talk with you and learn more. So, Nat, thanks so much for talking with me.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
If you enjoyed this podcast, you should check out my 2 episodes with Brian J. Jones. He's an author who wrote the biographies of George Lucas, Jim Henson, Theodore Geisel, and Washington Irving. We also recently talked about the rise of Skywalker. You can find those podcasts at tomorrowsociety.com. If you'd like to help out this listener-supported podcast, you can do so by becoming an official member of the Tomorrow Society. Through Patreon, you get access to some really cool perks, and you make a huge difference in keeping this podcast moving forward and giving me the chance to talk to great guests like Nathalia Holt today. I really appreciate all the support. If you'd like to get a hold of me, you can follow me on Twitter at TomorrowSOC or Facebook or Instagram at Tomorrow Society, or you can email me, dan@tomorrowsociety.com. The Tomorrow Society podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Dan Heaton. The music was written by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Next time, I'll be talking once again with former Disney Imagineer Jolene Cicero about Tokyo Disney Sea, Hong Kong Disneyland, the Disney Cruise Line, and so much more. It was a blast to catch up with Joe once again. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be talking with you again next time.